Hello, I'm the Hatter Professor. Let's talk hats.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Hats with me, Brad Bowers, the Hatter Professor. Today, we're going to talk about hat names, where they come from, and why they stick around. This hat, in particular, is the one we're discussing. Do you call this a bowler, or do you call it a derby? What's the difference between the two, or are they the same? Now, there are other international names that it's known by, but for today we're just going to stick with the English language versions. Well, if you call it a bowler, you're correct. And if you call it a derby, you're correct. I'll explain why. This style of hat originated in London in 1849. According to Lock and Company Hatters in London, if you go look on their website, they've got the story laid out there. They were asked to make a hat for Edward Coke, spelled C-O-K-E. I know normally we would pronounce it Coke, but it was pronounced Cook. Edward Coke is the younger brother of Thomas Cook, the second Earl of Leicester. And he was looking for a rigid hat that his gamekeepers could wear when they were out riding through the forest. They could run into a low-hanging branch and crack their skull. They could fall off their horse. Basically, he's looking for a riding helmet. And so he commissioned Lock and Company to make him one, and they turned to the hatters, William and Thomas Bowler, to make one. They made a stiff felt hat, rounded, a low crown compared to the stiff felt top hats that they made at the time. There were stiff felt hats made alongside the silk top hats as well. Silk and felt had different uses, usually case of formality. But the fur felt hats were so tall that there was kind of a concern that maybe that would work against the hat's advantage. So he wanted something, lower crown. And the bowlers made a stiff felt hat, heavily shellacked, that when Edward Cook stood on it and it didn't collapse, he was quite pleased and he paid for the hat. Lock and Company states they called it the Cook hat because that's their habit of naming hats after their customers, their originators. However, the hat has developed the name bowler from the Bowler brothers that, at least I'm assuming they're brothers, could be father and son, I'm not sure. But the bowlers who made the original hat. When you look on Wikipedia, you'll see several names listed for the bowler hat. Bowler, of course. You'll see Cook, because that's the model name that Lock and Company gave it. And in fact, they still use that name for it today. You'll see Bob hat, but I didn't research that one because I've rarely run across that. In fact, I can't even remember if I've ever run across it. And so I didn't bother to look that one up. But the one I have run across before is Billy Cock. Now, the Billy Cock starts out life as a completely different hat. References to Billy Cock go back to the 18th century, for instance. It's usually described as a rounded crown, low crown hat, so maybe similar in shape, perhaps, or style to the bowler. However, my guess is it was more of a soft felt hat than a stiff hat. It's also got more of a negative connotation to it because the references that you find throughout the 19th century referring to Billy Cock are always referring to people of a villainous nature, committing nefarious activities, usually robberies. They're going to be stealing from people or they're committing murders. and the perpetrators are described as wearing billycocks. It was more associated with the working class, so it's no surprise it's associated with the villainous class as well. But it's probably for that reason that it, while it may get associated later on with the bowler because of a similar shape or style, it doesn't catch on in the public's imagination like the name bowler does. So, bowlers made this in 1849. The first documented instance I can find of this being recorded in the public in newspapers is January 3rd, 1852. In kind of a lost and found article, there's some articles found, and one of them was a bowler hat. There's another reference in a newspaper I found from the year before, from 1851, from a hatter and a furrier that mentions bowlers, plural, but not necessarily as hats. However, I have to imagine that that's what it was, the style of hat. It appears that the name Cook didn't take off in the general public in their imagination, that it was in fact the bowlers that lent their name to the hat, and is where it almost immediately, you figure 2-3 years, that's pretty immediate back then, the public adopted it. And so this is the key to hat names, because it's the public that drives these names. Oftentimes it's not the manufacturers. For instance, most manufacturers in Britain and England would have called this just a stiff felt hat and left it at that. But with bowlers, the captures the public's imagination for whatever reason, and that's the name that's going to stick. So what about the Derby? Where does the Derby fit in? Well, in 1858, a man by the name of James Knapp opens a company, Crowfoot and Knapp Company, in East Norwalk, Connecticut. James Knapp, he'd been in the hatting business for a while with a couple of other earlier firms. But in 1858, he joined with Andrew Crowfoot to form Crowfoot and Knapp. Crowfoot was used to working with dyes for the hats, and that's why Knapp, as a hatter, needed someone that specialized in that. And so they formed Crowfoot and Knapp. And according to the company's reporting, by late 1860, James Knapp decides to copy this British style of hat that's been quite popular for the past decade over in the United Kingdom, and bring it to the United States. And so he creates the first of these styles of hats in the United States, or at least he claims it, and this is the record that we have of it. He takes the hat to a retailer on Broadway in New York, and they're trying to come up with a name for it. What are we going to call this hat? And because hats in England were quite commonly worn and associated with horse racing, and Knapp seems to think that this is, associated with horse racing as well, or equestrian sports. They decide, well, let's name it after the great race in Britain, the Derby. Of course, they don't call it the Derby. They don't pronounce it that way. They pronounce it as we would pronounce it, Derby, because it's spelled D-E-R-B-Y. And in England, that's pronounced Derby. Here, it's Derby. And so they introduced the first Derby in late 1860, and it sweeps the country. In fact, I refer to the Derby as the first democratic hat because it's adopted by men from all walks of life, from all of the classes, the upper classes, the middle class, the working class. Everyone seemed to want a Derby. With these two names, then, they become popular in their respective countries. Bowler continues its association all the way through to the present day. Derby, through most of the 20th century anyway, continues. However, today, I think we've kind of lost that association just because men don't wear it much anymore. And so I think our recollection here in the United States, we associate it more with England than we do with the United States. And thus we'll call it a bowler. I'm thinking, Monty Python making its way over here in the 1970s. And, you would see the Derby show up there. And of course, it's still worn, in the 70s and 80s by men, I think in the financial sectors in London. So it does hang around a lot longer there. Here, it's almost gone until around 1958, 1959, when we undergo a Derby revival. And part of this is associated with a movie called The Apartment with Jack Lemmon, in which he wears one. But the hat manufacturers, especially Hat Corporation of America, takes advantage of that, and they begin producing derbies again. They are quite different, though, from the ones they produced earlier in the century. The crowns are quite lower. They're also softer. They are not stiffened with shellac as much. And the curl is not the same. The D'Orsay curl that you get with the very narrow front and rear and the sides much wider, that's gone. The artisans that did all that curling have long since, been replaced. And, it's all done by a machine now. They also use sewing machines to sew the binding on instead of hand sewing it. The women in the trim rooms of the hat factories in the early 20th century would have, sewn these bindings on by hand using very beautiful invisible stitching. They're just gorgeous to look at. When you look at the modern ones, even to the present day, those stitches from the machines are very visible. Anyway, so I think that's why that, you'll find a lot of Americans that will refer to it as a bowler. Are they wrong? Yes and no. I feel like if the hat is made in the United States, we should call it a derby. If it's made in England, we should call it a bowler and leave it at that. But, you call it whatever you're most comfortable with, and we'll leave it at that. Especially if you were one to sport one of these. I love wearing them. This one, in fact, is from the 1910s. It's a Stetson. So, yes, it's officially a derby. With the derby, though, in terms of popular culture and acceptance of the hat, here we have the manufacturer naming it, and the name actually ends up sticking, which is interesting because you don't often see that. For instance, with the names Trilby and Fedora, and not to get too sidetracked here, because I do want to do a video about the Trilbys and Fedoras. Trilby and Fedora in the early 20th century are the same hat. All they are is a soft felt hat. The Fedora more associated with a snap brim. Trilby, perhaps less so, but I'm not quite sure on that. However, that was the only distinction between them. One name, Trilby, was used in England, and one, the Fedora, is used in the United States. The manufacturers on both sides of the pond would call them soft felt hats. That's it, or snap brim hats. That was their internal name for them. It's the public that takes the names Trilby and Fedora and runs with them. As we'll see in the video that I'll do. Trilby, actually, the name Trilby originates in the United States for hats. And as we'll see in that video later on, the English public kind of laughs at Americans for their obsession with Trilbys. And then England undergoes its own obsession with soft felt hats known as Trilbys. And in the United States, the fedora comes out of popular culture because of the hat that is associated with the play Fedora by Victor Sardou. With fedora, you've got the myth of the hat, depending on where you read it, either being a woman's hat that becomes adopted by men, or it's a man's hat that's worn by a woman and an actress, and she shocks the public. That is not true. That is definitely a myth. There is no historical evidence for that. It was always a man's hat, starting in 1882. But we'll talk about that in that video. But today, we'll use the terms differently. Trilby we call a very short brim, narrow brim fedora in England or in the United States. If it's narrow brim, we'll just call it a trilby because we've kind of borrowed that term. However, it was never originally related to brim width. It was always just a soft felt hat. And I think what happens is that in Britain, because the hat brims get narrower, the name trilby sticks with that. While in the United States, hat brims do get narrower in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They often are still called fedoras, though I think a lot of Americans will refer to them as trilbies, thinking it's related to the brim size, and in reality it's not. However, if we, the public, have made that distinction and made that decision, then perhaps that's just the evolution of the name. The Derby, interestingly, seems to have had some competition, or else there's some confusion. The earliest references I can find to the Derby in newspapers is 1864. So it's possible that it didn't become popular for a few years when Knapp first introduced it, or perhaps the company's internal lore was off by a few years. But the Derby does show up in both the spring of 1864 and then the fall of 1864, but in two different scenarios. For instance, in spring, the hat is referred to as a cloth hat, which I've never seen a cloth derby, never heard of a cloth hat referred to as the derby. So I'm not sure what that would have looked like. You can see in these ads, it's talking about hats that are cloth hats. However, by the fall of 1864, it's definitely referred to as a stiff felt hat. So what happened there, I don't know. Were they two different hats, or did they somehow just call a stiff felt hat a cloth hat? Hard to say. There are no images associated with these references in the newspapers at the time. However, the American public had adopted the name Derby, and they're going to run with that. There's one last interesting story about stiff felt hats in England that I want to share, just because it's amusing. In 1850, there appears to have been a backlash against the tall, stiff hats, whether they're fur felt or silk plush, or there were still a few being made out of beaver at the time, but not very many. And some in England were quite unhappy with having to wear the hats, because they're stiff, so if they're not fitted properly, they can be very uncomfortable. And so there's this pushback against stiff hats. You can see that in this particular article, I would call it a letter to the editor, but it talks about the Anti-Stiff Hat Association. In the Midland Counties Herald, there's a letter from a gentleman signing himself Hatophobia, who suggests the organization of a society to discountenance, by example and precept, the wearing of hats. He says, "As a sufferer from the perverse fashion of wearing hard, black chimney pots on the heads of all who would not appear singular, I observe, with great consolation, that our French neighbors propose to exhibit a variety of hats at the exhibition next year. Certainly no part of British male costume, ugly as it is from hat to boot, and senseless and costly as it is ugly, no part is more odious than the covering we are doomed to wear upon our heads from year to year, and from generation to generation, as if we were perversely determined to stick to one fashion as Turks and Quakers, without the lightness of the one and the shadiness of the other." I've resolved myself to set the world at defiance, and if the hatters are so obstinate as to invent nothing more comfortable than heavy felt and pasteboard pots by the time of the exhibition of 1851, I shall do without them altogether. I trust you will lend your powerful aid in favor of the anti-stiff hat movement. So that was in 1850, August 31st, and he's referring to the great exhibition that is going to be happening the next year, the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, also known as the Crystal Palace Exhibition, put on by Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. The push against these style of hats will continue through 1851, and in fact, describing hats that are on display at the exhibition. They note that they are trying to adjust to this idea that hats maybe shouldn't be so uncomfortable. So here it says there are various descriptions of flexible headgear intended as substitutes for the stiff hat. They are not, however, exactly the kind of thing which we apprehend will take with the British public. We would encourage our manufacturers to try again, and, reinforced by the assistance of artists of taste, we have no doubt that at the next exhibition, the stiff black cylindrical hat of the present day will be regarded as a curiosity. Everyone was led to believe that the year 1851 would witness the downfall of the stiff, black, doleful-looking cylinder, which the sons of men for the last 60 years have been doomed to carry with them in their wanderings upon the earth. Vain hope! The eternal stiff hat, like the brand of Cain, still marks us as outcasts from continental civilization and comfort. It is estimated, says the official illustrated catalog, that about 250,000 dozens of hats are annually made in London, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Glasgow. What an amount of torture, discomfort, ruined health, and premature baldness is included in these figures. We are not without hope, however, that ultimately some headgear may be devised which, stopping short of the ridiculous and theatrical substitutes at present proposed, may commend itself to the comfort and common sense of the wearers. So it's clear that 1850 and 1851, there was a desire for a hat to supplant the silk top hat. And it's surprising then that the bowler becomes the one to do that, because it's a stiff felt hat, and part of the problem they were having was stiff hats. However, I think because it was so distinguishable from the cylindrical top hat that okay, we'll accept it. We'll take it. It's ours. It's British. It's not a French style like the top hat was. And we're just going to make this our own and claim it for ourselves. There's an irony there. They wanted to get rid of stiff felt hats, or stiff hats in general, and they stuck with stiff hats. But it's also, I think, the primary motivation why it became so popular in the British culture and social imagination is because it was very uniquely theirs. I'm just going to leave you on that note. I hope you've enjoyed this and gotten something out of it, and check back for the next Let's Talk Hats, and one of these days I'll do the Trilby and Fedora one that you are probably waiting for. Anyway, take care.